Hi, this is Mr. Fernandez with a quick-ish model response to this week's DBQ um, that will hopefully help you to reflect on your own performance on this DBQ and get you closer and closer to being able to rock it in May when you take the modified version of the AP exam. Um, you'll notice that, well, Fernandez students, you'll notice that the DBQ rubric that I posted, which is the one we've been using all year, has been slightly modified because the exam only this version of the test will only ask you to will only have 5 documents as opposed to 7. Will only ask you to include 4 of those documents in your analysis and 2 um, analyses of historical context, intended audience, purpose, or point of view. So 2 HIPs. That's different from the longer version of the DBQ we've been doing for the last few months. So the last portion here of the rubric, therefore, reflects that, just FYI. So that's one difference. But let's go ahead and go over the prompt real quick that you guys did. To what extent did manifest destiny and territorial expansion cause unity and division in the U.S. from 1830 to 1860? So first and foremost, 2 things that will be helpful for you are this is the template we've been using for cause and effect. There's really 2. I propose there are 2 ways to answer this question. You could say that there was more unity than division, or more division than unity that was caused by manifest destiny and territorial expansion in the 1830s, 1840s, and into the 1850s. Or in which case you would take this approach to writing the thesis and the body paragraphs, or you can just argue that there's reason to argue that there was some significant amounts of significant levels of unity that resulted from manifest destiny, and also division. So taking a more balanced approach, in which case then you take the option B approach. That's because, again, just like last week's essay prompt, they're kind of they're asking you more than they're being more specific, more precise in terms of what they're asking you to do. Instead of just a general question about the general causes of something or the effects of something, they're asking you specifically whether or not the event in question, the development in question here, had certain effects. So that allows you to answer basically yes or no, a take a dichotomous approach to the essay. Either there was unity or division. That's different from just kind of talking generally about effects. I think it's easier. I hope you agree. And with any luck, that's the kind of cause or effect question they'll ask you, as opposed to the more general one, which I think is more complicated. All right, so here's how I answered it with my model response to this DBQ. Remember that one of the first things you have to do is contextualization. And contextualization has to be something, a discussion of a broader historical topic. That's something that happened either before the time period in question, which here would be 1830. So anything that happened before 1830, although not too far before 1830, immediately before 1830, or after 1860. So those are the 2. That's the easiest approach to contextualization. For example, you can see yourself starting your essay by talking about the U.S. Civil War, which started in 1861, right? And you can say, hey, the Civil War happened, the war between the states, between northern and southern states over the question of slavery. You can started with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the Battle of Fort Sumter in the aftermath of that election. And then you can say, okay, so that that basically was the end of this long period of divisiveness or debate that was engendered by territorial expansion, and then you can segue into the topic. I decided to talk about something that happened before 1830, the War of 1812. If you're talking about something that happened between 1830 and 1860, then you want to avoid westward expansion, the debate over slavery, things that are in the documents that you're almost certainly going to talk about, unless you don't, but that are really, part of this topic. So you have to try to find something else that was going on at the time that is indirectly related to the topic. So off the top of my head, there are lots of things I could think about. You can talk about the Industrial Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, the Jacksonian democracy, the expansion of voting rights for white men, for example. The reform movements, especially women's suffrage, education, temperance, and things like that. The important thing is that whatever you talk about, whether it be something that happened after 1860, like the Civil War, before 1830, like the War of 1812, or during this time period between 1830 and 1860, like Jacksonian democracy, or the women's suffrage movement, you have to both describe something as that's pretty specific, not just throw it out there, and you have to explain how the context relates to the topic of the prompt. So you can't just say, hey, during this time there were reform movements. Okay, on to westward expansion and the topic. You have to make the connection. You have to explain to the author, to the reader rather, why you're talking about this specific thing in connection with this topic. So this is all very tricky, which is why people have a hard time with it. Here's what I did with the War of 1812. And this is my contextualization here. The War of 1812 is often referred to as the Second War for Independence against Great Britain. The end of the war, which was fought primarily in the Great Lakes region along the border between the U.S. and British Canada, eliminated the threat of British and British-supported Native Americans along much of the frontier. Notice how I say a little bit about the War of 1812, who were the two sides, where the war was fought, and then, at the end, and opened up the West to unfettered expansion by white Americans. The topic of this essay is westward expansion. I'm talking about something that happened before 1830, but connecting it to the topic of the question, which is westward expansion, with that, especially with that last clause there. So that is something you have to do to get the point for contextualization. Not just talk about a random thing, but explain how it connects. Next thing I have to do, if you follow this template, is explore the counterclaim. So I'm going to argue that it was mostly division. The expansion of American territory in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s mostly caused conflict. There's no right answer to this question. You could argue that it mostly caused unity, but I'm going to argue that it mostly caused conflict. Or remember, you can argue that it was a little bit of both. But I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to suggest that I really can't bring myself to argue that it was an even division between divisiveness and unity, because as far as I can tell, the evidence suggests that it was mostly conflict that was engendered by westward expansion. So I'd be lying to myself if I tried to argue otherwise. So that's what I'm going to argue. But, in order to get a point on the AP exam for argument development, you have to explore the complexity of the issue. You can't just talk about all unity or all division. You have to talk about both in some way. I'm making an argument that it was mostly conflict that was caused by this westward expansion. So then I have to, somewhere in my essay, pay lip service to those who would argue otherwise. And that's what I do in this part of the essay. I kind of dispense with my detractors, those who would disagree with me, by exploring a little bit of their argument, but suggesting that they're wrong. And here's how I do that in my essay. Some might argue, let me get over here. Some might argue that the expansionist decades that followed the War of 1812, especially between 1830 and 1860, which are the dates that they give us to write about, united white Americans by generating great popular support for territorial expansion. So my counterclaim is that some might argue that there was more unity. But I say more than just that. I explain one category of unity, and that is unity around the popular support for territorial expansion. I'm suggesting that most Americans seem to embrace westward expansion, and that is why there was more unity as a result of manifest destiny. I need to have that's something that's I'm suggesting somebody else would argue. So, but then after that, I can't just leave it at that. I have to provide at least one piece of evidence that one of those people would use. If not, if I haven't done that, then I'm not being honest. And so I do that by talking about the Oregon Trail. They might point to the tens of thousands of Americans who traveled along the Oregon Trail in the 1830s and 1840s. That's a lot of people before the 1846 treaty that divided the land between British Canada and the United States as evidence of this popular embrace of expansionism. So as a result of that, I have looked at my counterclaim and described some evidence that might support a counterclaim. And so I have therefore earned the points for providing a historically defensible counterclaim, something that is true or could be defended with evidence. I wasn't too vague or too specific. I didn't say that some might argue there was more unity because of economic reasons. That's too vague. Or some might argue that there was more unity among Americans because of the Oregon Trail. That's too specific. I need to provide a broad category that's not so vague that it's unintelligible, but not too specific, so specific that it kind of gives away the evidence or suggests that there's really only one example of that phenomenon. Your counterclaim should have several possible examples, and you choose one of those examples. And then here, follow your counterclaim up with a discussion of that specific, substantial, relevant, and accurate, don't just BS it, example of historical evidence that you describe adequately. You don't just throw it out there, but say something about it. So notice how I talk about the Oregon Trail, tens of thousands of Americans who traveled along it. I talk about how this all happened before the 1846 treaty that divided the land between British Canada and the United States. And so it's well described enough for the purposes of the AP exam, and it's a specific and accurate example, and it's relevant, obviously. So I'm done with that part. I have, in other words, talked about contextualization. I have provided the what some would argue is a counter argument. Now, to what I'm going to argue. Now, you can do this if applicable, if it makes sense. If there's a document or two that sort of go along with a counterclaim, the opposite of what you're arguing, then throw it in there. Remember that when you use a document, you have to do two things with that document. And it's not up here, but it is down here. You have to A, describe the document. So say what's in the document. What is happening? What is the image? What is happening in the image if it's an illustration of some kind? What is the person saying if it's a text? And you have to explain why you're including it in this paragraph. In other words, why does it fit with this claim or counterclaim? And if you want to do that for this document, although you only have to do that now for two documents, analyze it for historical context, audience, point of view, or purpose. Okay, so here's what I do. I provide a document. One of the documents there is document 3, John O'Sullivan's idea that it was Americans' manifest destiny to spread across the entire North American continent. And I say, so there's me describing the document a little bit. And then I say, it may have spoken for many Americans who believe that Anglo-Saxon or European migration westward was the natural, quote, natural flow of events. Thank you. No problem. So what I've done there is two things with the document. Again, I described it a little bit. John O'Sullivan's idea that it was Americans' manifest destiny to spread across the entire North American continent. And then I suggest that this may have spoken to the many Americans who believed that, it was their Americans' destiny to do this. I have, in other words, connected it to the counterclaim that Americans embraced the idea of territorial expansion, and I have described the document a little bit. I don't bother with historical context or intended audience or purpose or point of view for that document. I decide I'm going to do it with the other documents later. Okay, so I've gotten rid of one document, and I provided my contextualization, my counterclaim, and my counterclaim evidence. I've done all of that stuff. Now, finally, I'm going to get to my own argument, which is that all of that be damned, the truth of the matter is that territorial expansion and the idea of manifest destiny actually caused division among Americans. And here's where I do that. However, the era of expansionism between 1830 and 1860 actually engendered more division than unity among white Americans. That, in other words, is my argument. My grand argument. It was this, not that. And now I have to have, I would propose at least two claims, meaning two broad categories of analysis that support that argument, that there was more division than unity among white Americans. And here's my two claims. Firstly, I say westward expansion was an important factor that helped end the era of good feelings in the 1820s and produce the divisive second-party system. And then, secondly, and even more importantly, the era of manifest destiny exacerbated the debate around slavery in a way that ultimately led to the Civil War. Those are the two things I'm going to be looking at, one broad claim per paragraph. Notice how my claims adhere to what I've been calling the Goldilocks rule. Westward exacerbating the debate around slavery in a way that ultimately led to the Civil War is a way of describing a broad phenomenon. That's not vague. I'm getting across the point that a whole bunch of things happened thanks to the era of manifest destiny that made slavery a sticking point that ultimately led to the Civil War. It would be too vague to say something like, one cause of manifest destiny was political strife. What do you mean? What kind of political strife? Around what issue? What were the consequences of that political strife? You need to say a little bit more. But then again, a lot of students are always tempted to just get into the specifics, to show off and say that they know, show that they know a bunch of things. So, about a bunch of specifics. So they might say something like, oh, the era of manifest destiny led to the Compromise of 1850. Sure, that's one example of how the era of manifest destiny exacerbated the debate around slavery, but there's a lot more than that. And so you have to be sure that the claim you're providing holds several possible examples. If it's just one thing, one very specific, minute thing, it's unlikely to be a strong or even viable claim. So this is what we've been working on all year, the Goldilocks rule. Okay, got my thesis out of the way. I've done all of these things now. And so I'm moving on to my first body paragraph. I'm going to take my first claim from up here, and just basically copy and paste it down here. And now I'm going to explore it more thoroughly by first talking about evidence. Oops, that's this part here. So I have to describe some evidence that supports that first claim. And when I do that, that evidence had better be specific, substantial, something major, relevant, something that is actually related to the topic and to my claim, and accurate. Don't get it wrong. And adequately described. And don't forget that I can't use something that was explicitly referenced in the documents. Meaning, if the document says something about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, which ended the U.S.-Mexico War, that cannot be the piece of evidence that I use here to try and get that point. It has to be something that is not explicitly referenced in the documents. And what I use is the Wilmot. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking about something else. I use is the rise of the Whig Party. So let me explain. Let me show you. Westward expansion was an important factor that helped end the era of good feelings in the 1820s and produce a divisive second-party system. That's my broad claim. After the War of 1812, the Federalist Party dropped out of the national political scene, leaving the Democratic Republican Party as the only viable party. The era of good feelings was shattered by the early 1830s when the Democratic Republicans split into the Jacksonian Democrats and the new Whig Party. So that's my specific piece of evidence. And now I move on to the second part of the body paragraph, aside from the claim, which is just basically imported from the thesis, and the evidence, which is new, to the reasoning part. Here is where I have to show the connection between the piece of the claim that I'm making and the effect, which is disunity. I have to show how westward expansion and manifest destiny caused the disunity I'm arguing was the result of those things. A lot of students would be content to just leave it at that. Like, just that would be their discussion, and because hey, it goes without saying. You might argue, you might think to yourself, it's implied that hey, the these things are related, but you have to be explicit in your reasoning, and meaning you have to connect the dots for the reader, not expect the reader to do that for you. And that's what I do in these couple of sentences here. I just draw the line between westward expansion and the shattering of political consensus and the development of a new and divisive two-party system in the 1830s and beyond. Although there are several reasons for this split, one was certainly the debate around expansionism. By the 1830s, many of those who chose to support the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson were Southerners and Westerners who were optimistic about opportunities made available through the growing trend toward westward expansion. On the other hand, Whigs were more likely to be Northerners who feared that the growth of the country westward might undermine the power of those in the North. Okay, so I've gotten that done, and now documents. If applicable, I will include documents in this paragraph that connect to my claim. Remember, put documents in here if they connect to the claim in some way. Be prepared to describe the document and then explain clearly how it relates to your claim in that paragraph. I use two documents here. One of the biggest sources of strife between Democrats and the New Whigs in the 1830s and 1840s was the annexation of Texas after its war for independence against Mexico. I don't use Texas up here as my evidence because it's all over the documents. There's like 2 or 3 documents that specifically talks about the annexation of Texas. But I can use it down here to talk, to provide information related to the documents. It's kind of crucial that I do. William Ellery Channing articulated the Whig position by explaining that the U.S. ought to oppose annexing Texas in part to avoid war with Mexico. That's document 1. And that is a reflection of, I say a little bit about William Ellery Channing's document in which he explains that the U.S. ought to oppose annexing Texas in part to avoid war with Mexico. So I basically summarize the document there. And then here I say that he articulated the Whig position. In other words, in that short clause, I make the connection between the document and this claim I'm making that the new political parties of the 1830s were the result of debate around the expansion of American territory. Second document I use is James K. Polk's. James K. Polk, on the other hand, reflects the Democrat support for Texas annexation. So again, what I've done there is connected the document to the growing, or rather the birth of a new party system, the Democrats and the Whigs. And then here I describe it a little bit by suggesting that Americans should embrace the new state or risk future wars with its new independent neighbor. So, in other words, That's it. I described that in that last part there. I describe the document a little bit. I summarize it. So I've done those two things. I've described the document, each document, and explained how it relates. Even if it's a short explanation, that will suffice. I do not bother with this for either of those two documents. I only have to do it for two, so I saved it to the end. Let's move on to the last paragraph. In the second body paragraph, I take my second claim, I copy and paste it down there, then I provide my first piece of evidence, my only piece of evidence. Remember, it has to be something that is not explicitly in the documents. So I take, even though the U.S.-Mexico War is kind of referenced in the document, one thing that is not is David Wilmot's proviso, and so I use that. Perhaps the most important result of the era of westward expansion in the 1830s and 1840s was the political conflict around slavery that would soon lead to the U.S. Civil War. The U.S.-Mexico War illustrates this point. Toward the beginning of the war, Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduced a proviso into a military spending bill that would have made slavery illegal in any territory acquired as a result of the war. Although the Wilmot Proviso failed to pass, it and the war opened a floodgate of debate around slavery. So, I've done the things I've had to do. I have, going back to the rubric, I have included my claim, just copied and pasted from the top, the thesis. I provided one specific Wilmot Proviso, substantial, that's a pretty big thing, relevant, obviously relevant to the debate around slavery and westward expansion, and accurate, I describe accurately the Wilmot Proviso, and I describe it adequately. And it's not explicitly referenced in the document, so I'm safe. Point for me. Now I get to the reasoning part. I have to explain how the westward expansion and Manifest Destiny caused divisions around slavery. That's my point in that paragraph, and here's how I do it. Before the U.S.-Mexico War, Congress had managed to evade the acrimonious debate over slavery for several decades. The U.S.-Mexico War ended with the signing of a treaty that would make almost half of Mexican territory part of the United States. The debate about whether or not legal slavery would be permitted in that territory would create a storm of controversy that would snowball into the Civil War. That's it. I connect the dots between the westward expansion and divisions around slavery. Moving on now, I cover my last two documents. Remember that for those documents I have to describe each one, summarize it, what's in it, and explain why it's there. Why is it in this paragraph? How is it connected to my claim that westward expansion led to divisions around, political divisions around the question of slavery and its extension to beyond its existing boundaries. I start with one document, document 2. In the 1847 editorial in the Democratic Review illustrates the pro-slavery position in this debate. So I'm suggesting that it is an example of those who support the extension of slavery into new territories, which is certainly part of my related to the claim I'm making. In it, here's my description. The author argues that any states created from the Mexican cession would, under the terms of the U.S. Constitution, be entitled to enact legal protections for slavery. That's my summary. And then here I do the thing I haven't done yet. I describe in this case, the point of view. How does who is it that's writing this? And how does that reflect, or how is that reflected in the text itself? The editorialist for the Democratic Review, a leading voice of the Democratic Party and its many pro-slavery constituents, that's the point of view of this editorial, makes no apologies for those who supported the acquisition of Texas, quote, for the purpose of extending slavery. That's my brief analysis suggesting that because of the point of view, certain ideas are presented in certain ways. The editorialist doesn't chooses to embrace the notion that the extension of American territory into the West was welcomed by people who wanted to expand slavery. For a lot of other kinds of writers with other points of view, even if they supported expansion, that might have been a touchy subject, something they'd want to avoid, something they wouldn't want to admit. But a Democrat who's writing in one of the official organs of the Democratic Party, which had among its readers rabidly pro-slavery constituents, makes no apologies for that. And so that's how the point of view is reflected in the language and ideas of the document. My last document is very different perspective. Abolitionist Charles Sumner's resolution in the Massachusetts legislature, on the other hand, reflects the ideas of those who opposed the expansion of slavery into these new territories. That's me explaining why I'm talking about this document in this paragraph, which is about the debate around slavery expanding into new territories. And then here I describe the document as he argues that the war was fought on false pretenses and in part as an excuse by the Southern slave power to deepen its hold on American politics. I have summarized the document. And then finally, I go ahead and provide a quick analysis of the point of view. Written from the point of view of a staunch abolitionist and northerner, Sumner's resolution makes the dramatic claim that slavery supporters are plotting to obtain the control of the free states. Dramatic, perhaps exaggerated. Let me be clear there. Claim that slavery supporters are plotting to obtain the control of the free states. A rabid abolitionist, he sees any support for slavery as potentially inviting the quote slave power to take over the whole country. And certainly there was for some people, for a lot of people, there was good reason to believe that that was the case. But this was more likely a position that would have been articulated by an abolitionist, as opposed to a political moderate in the 1840s and 1850s. So I make that point with my brief analysis there. And that's it. I have done all the things for body paragraph number 2. No fancy conclusion required. I have done all the things that the College Board wants me to do, and have gotten all the points I am entitled to on the rubric. All right, so go ahead and grade your own using either the official College Board rubric or the one that we've been using, the Fernandez clan has been using in class all year. And fill out that form to reflect on your own performance. Thank you. Miss you all. Bye.